Hello, everyone. Welcome to Panel 1A, titled Problematizing Filipino Identity. And may I just recognize the presenters who will form this panel. We have Dr. Severo Madrona from Ateneo de Manila University. Ver, can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes, can hear you. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Ver. And Dr. David Gowey from Arizona State University. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, very good. Unfortunately, Dr. John G. Malek of University of Manitoba just emailed me telling me that he cannot participate in our conference. So that means, Ver, you will have to present first to be followed immediately by David. Ver, is your presentation ready?
Yes, yes.
Okay, very good. So just to welcome you again formally, this panel is panel 1A, problematizing problematizing Filipino identity. May we just request everyone to keep their mics on mute and their videos off. Each presenter will be given 20 minutes to present, and all questions should be asked at the end of all presentations. So we begin with Dr. Severo Madrona of Ateneo de Manila University, to be followed immediately by Dr. David Gowey of Arizona State University. Ver, if you are already ready, I think you have your presentation on share screen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to participate in the conference. Paper actually is on the historical evolution of citizenship in Spain, its implication, definition, and identity in the colonial Philippines, inquiry, sort of somewhat a history of the Philippines together with Spain. So my concept actually is much more with how Spanish citizenship evolved and how it affected this in the Philippines, as well as that how they have treated actually somewhat locals here for us, the Filipinos, during the colonial period. Moving to look at the evolution of citizenship, it also affected with us. Started their concept of Greco-Roman concept of citizenship, which is the concept of sanguinis, which we always heard now as being followed likewise. And moving with the medieval period, which is moving towards the concept of jus soli, going to discuss later on, concept much with attachment to the land, and then how the Habsburg, with King Philip II, changed everything then with respect to colonization and how he treated, or how the Habsburg actually treated then the Spaniards in Spain and how affected the civilizations in the other parts of the world. Then here comes the Bourbon reforms. Then the 1812 institution of CADIZ, which somewhat changed everything then and how it affected with that. And lastly, with the Código Civil of Spain. So we'll start first with the concept of the Greco-Roman citizenship. For the Greeks, the idea actually of citizenship focused much with the concept of family, or it concerns about the characterized with tradition, law, and education, and required a concentration of loyalty to the territory. Concerns much that there should be a connection of one person to that of another. On the other hand, the Romans was complex, flexible, legalistic, and generous. It's based on that relationship, rationalized the principle of sanguinis as basis for citizenship. Starting the 12 tables, Romans laid down the relationship between citizens as well as that of non-citizens of Rome. Now, however, you also granted if you are not part, let's say, of the sanguinis, you might be given certain rights. These are reserved for supposedly non-Romans or citizens but of Romans. So you have to be given then private rights. So private rights are given mainly actually to those who are considered as Romans but doesn't have blood or the relationship, as we call about as Roman, it's under the principle of sanguinis. However, those who are considered then as public citizen or considered citizens, and so far as they have the blood lineages, they would be given the sort of public rights, service in the army, voting assembly, public office eligibility, the right of legal protection and appeal. Other side, the private rights, those are considered as Roman citizens, but not lineages or blood lineages. They have given the right of intermarriages and right to trade with that of other Roman citizens. The Romans also provided what we call as then as half citizenship, so without the franchise, and likewise dual citizenship. You're considered to be inhabitants of your area, conquered with the Romans, then also being given a Roman citizenship. But again, they could not have public rights. You don't have the rights. Again, you lost in that things then. Here comes now with the medieval Spain. We're aware about Spain as being conquered and acquired by the Roman Empire. Afterwards, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, you have the concept now of Spain actually having to consider itself a medieval. And urban citizenship in medieval Spain, essentially Spanish people that have been seen, we know actually conservative neighborhood who enjoyed privileges but subjected to various obligations and responsibilities in cities. Within that may be lost if one failed to follow the conditions or residents in the city. The concept here is that medieval Spain, following in feudalism, into the concept useful. So the idea is that under the Siete Partidas, usually is not returning granting in medieval Spain. Useful principle is connected to the tradition is those born territory were subject to the Lord land, and thus those subjects are tied to the power of the king. However, the Roman principle of jus sanguinis is still being applicable as provided in the Siete Partidas. This is just actually the relation of naturalista, what they call subjects, based both on jus soli and jus sanguinis, emerge. Thus, the son's naturalista will be his parents and their birthplace if they have naturalista there. So, in medieval Spain, you also heard the concept now of naturalista subject. It will be very important when you move now to the next stage, the so-called Habsburg concept of citizenship then. We're very much aware of King II, or at the time then, who became King of Spain. He strengthened the categorization of Castilian naturalis. So naturalis again subject, and until the second prize, actually during the period, and the Philippines was colonized, 1665 up to 1620, only the Castilian naturalis were allowed actually to or to given positions in the colonies as well as in the Spanish Empire. So you have Southern Spain itself, you have giving advantage to the so-called Castilian naturalis to the detriment of other nations or the other subjects within the empire. So you have the Catalans, you have other groups already part of the Spanish Empire that been given kind of privilege by Philip II. So, another principle of sanguinis, Castilian naturalis, they were granted certain privileges from those who were not. As a result, Castilian naturalis monopolized offices and benefits in the period of the Spanish Empire, as they were appointed king to govern the empire in the New World to the detriment of non-Castilians who were born in Spain, subject of other Peninsular kingdoms like Portugal, Valencia, Barcelona, but considered as winners by King Philip II. So it gives an insight now why we're more concerned with the Castilians or the Castilla, as called them, and not with other quote-unquote Spanish naturales. That has been, because again, the beginning, from almost 100 years, the Habsburg actually focused mainly with that of the Castilian naturales. But 1620, considering the demand for economic utilization of the Spanish dominion, King Philip III abandoned the Castilian naturales to a more expansive Spanish naturales in the government of the Spanish Empire. Thus, in 1620, it abandoned the so-called priority or prioritization of Castilian naturales. As a result of it, non-Castilians were appointed by the Spanish monarch to colonies in America and likewise in the Philippines. So, as mentally they continue, look about this. Yes.
There. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry,
Yes.
because
Yes.
your audio is sort of choppy. Is
Sorry.
there a way to improve your audio?
Okay. You know, it's still choppy.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have a mic?
Top of mic. Sorry, I can. Maybe I'll be using.
Or maybe you can turn off some of the background applications you have there on your device.
Hello. Hello.
Hi there. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. So is it loud now or sorry?
Maybe you have a device somewhere there in your room that's running. Maybe if you can turn that off, we can have a better audio.
So is it now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, you may proceed. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for quality. So, going back again to our discussion a while ago. So, maybe again about the effect of Castilian Naturalis and the Spanish Naturalis in colonial systems that there's some concern now with typification of resident in colonial Philippines. So, as discussed in Santino, for instance, you only have 3 groups of people in the Philippines where they're not citizens, but more burdens. So again, as mentioned before, almost 100 years, focus mainly on the Castilian Naturalis and the Spanish, not with other groups of people in Spain at the time or the other subjects. But as talk about, here you have the Spanish, Indio, as well as that of the Chinese. Now, later on, as you move with socioeconomic certification development, you have again the Spaniards, but among themselves, you have again a contest between either the Castilian Naturalis or the Spanish Naturalis, and will continue the Bourbon reforms with the war Spanish occupation. So you have again in the province at the time, you have Spaniards, Chinese Tizos, you have native principales, Indios, you have the Chinese, then you have masses or Indios. So using again socioeconomic certifications at the time then, Spain, at this time. Now, going to Bourbon reforms, as I mentioned a while ago, it's again much more particular here. It's again picks up, actually the concept of reforms being then the King Philip V, the first Bourbon monarch of Spain. So essentially the reforms actually in the Castilian Naturalis to appease the rival kingdoms like the Catalans and support allied kingdoms, the Navarre and the Basque Country. The latter would be allowed to retain their naturaleza with respect to their territories, but they gain general naturaleza and the Spanish dominion. The rebel Catalans naturaleza, however, would be respected. A centralized Bourbon monarchy with concepts like capitanías, intendencia, audiencia for all autonomous bodies. So according to the Bourbon reform, everyone they granted local general naturaleza to all Spaniards in the peninsula. As a result, you have now more of the so-called, as long as you were born in Spain, you should be given what you call the recognition in that of the colonies. So the Criollos, as opposed by the legislation, felt the members actually of the Castile crown together with the other peninsular kings. So it's a contest actually now between those Criollos or the mestizos versus those actually who supposedly claim of naturaleza in Iberian Peninsula, in particular again with that of Castilian as well as that of other kings. So Criollos on the other hand, they claim both American and peninsular naturaleza. 18th century Criollos and Peninsulars competed by mutual exclusion. Since then, an identity of confrontation with the Europeans can be observed in the colonies actually. So starting actually with Latin America, it will be brought to the Philippines, the competition now between the Criollos as well as that of the peninsular naturaleza, again claim with that Spanish subject. It changed altogether with the so-called Constitution of CADIZ of 1812. The Spanish nation is the reunion of all the Spanish from both hemispheres. So this constitution of CADIZ, we have constitutional naturalized citizens, those who descended on both lines from naturales from the Peninsula, America, Asia, and other Spanish states. However, excluding those with even remote origins in foreign African countries. So the only exception provided in the Constitution actually. So all colonies of Spain then, those born in the Constitution will be considered as Spanish naturaleza or Spanish citizens in this concept, except those in Africa. So, however, it defines again two kinds of concepts. You have Spaniards as well as Spanish citizens then. Spaniards are all freemen who are born and are vecinos in the Spanish Dominion as well as their children. So you have elements of freedom, Sangeni, Yoso, and settlement. On the other hand, citizens, so you have now two distinctions. The Spaniards, we call them the Spaniards, have again concept that came from the peninsula actually, either they claim Yusangay, that is that their parents are all of Spaniards, or Yusoli, they were born and they live there, so that's we call them Spaniards. But Spanish citizens are those Spaniards who, on both ascendant lines, have their origin in the Spanish Dominion of both hemispheres and are vecinos in a town of the said dominions. So I mentioned again, Constitution of CADIZ then made this vital distinction between Spaniards and Spanish citizens. In spite of the aspiration to constitute a nation of Spaniards who embrace population masses, all forms of inclusions and exclusions persisted among permanent members of the community. We have the business allowed for inclusion of the Abencedados, the Spanish, the Creole, the Indians, who were native to the region, and non-Abencedados, but determined the exclusion of Africans and their descendants. So you have actually a discrimination to Africans, slave trade, so objected by the Americans. Now, you have disputes then in the colony, especially in the Philippines time. You have the concept, as we will discuss this in the Philippine history, the distinction between peninsulares. Well, they were both supposedly Spaniards, but one born in the peninsula and one born in the island, which somewhat discriminated among these two, between the two groups. You also have to consider then the discussion between the Creoles and Peninsulares. So you have the Españoles Filipinos felt they were discriminated against in the matter of government appointments and motions. So again, the Creole, you have learned the concept the Ciso class competing now with the Pinares. The Creoles, as we mentioned, same group in Latin America, who were contesting likewise have to be given certain privileges that was reserved only for the Peninsulares. And likewise, going third in the Philippines, like the distinction between the Chinese mestizos as well as the Spaniards. The Chinese mestizos who benefited much with the opening of Manila to world commerce as well as issues, economic and political advancement. In the fourth dispute, we have the natives, the Spaniards. The natives then contested with the
Dr. Madrona, I think Dr. Madrona lost his internet connection. Yeah, I think he got disconnected. In any case, maybe we can now proceed to the next meeting, given that Dr. Madrona got disconnected. David, are you ready to present?
Yes. Hello.
Okay. Thank you, David. Sorry about that. Sorry for the inconvenience, but since Dr. Madrona has been disconnected, maybe we can begin with your presentation, if it's okay.
Yes, it's fine. I'd like to apologize in advance in case I have technical difficulties because I have to present off my phone right now.
It's okay, no problem.
Okay. All right, so as introduced, my name is David Gowey. I'm at Arizona State University. Not a doctor yet, but still hoping to get there in the next couple of years. I'm a PhD student in sociocultural anthropology, and my presentation today is entitled Pagkaing Pinoy, Panlasang, Pandaigdig, the globalization of Filipino foodways from the Manila Galleon trade to Jollibee. And I realize this is an awfully long time period, so I will try to hit the highlights of my paper. And the first is a little more local to me than it is to all of you there in the Philippines and elsewhere. On December 28th of last year, we had our first Jollibee open in the state of Arizona in the city of Chandler, which is about a 20-minute drive away from me. And of course, I was there. It was very cold, as you can see, with all the snow jackets. We're standing out in the drive-through, and it took, I think, 3 hours to get inside because there was so much excitement about getting in there to experience Jollibee in a lot closer environment than having to drive to, say, California or Nevada, which is about 5 or 6 hours away, as people in Arizona previously had to do. And so the idea of this paper was already sort of, I believe I'd already submitted my abstract at this time, but either way, the thought was starting to grow in my mind. Like, how is it that in 2019, I can be an American, a white American citizen in a former Spanish, then Mexican territory, eating Filipino food that is, in many respects, imported American food that's been Filipinized, listening to Mexican pop music on the radio. So all these things fed into the paper as well. So to get into the methodological literatures that I tried to pull from in this paper, as a sociocultural anthropologist, I really wanted to start primarily with an anthropology of food. And a lot of that inspiration came out of the work of Sidney Mintz, who wrote Sweetness and Power, about the adoption of sugar by the British and the legacy of slavery that was entangled with. Also pulled from a 1976 book by Esther Capotaje that talks about subsistence farming in Dologon, Mindanao. And as will be shown in the presentation in a couple slides, I also tried to get at the complication of describing what is food versus what is medicine. Because in many cultural contexts, not just the Philippines, but in this particular case, in the Philippines and Spain and Mexico, the line between food and medicine is something that's culturally constructed. So looking at Michael Tan's work on Basma, Kalman, Usog, and Warwick Anderson's work, Colonial Pathologies, among others. And especially Planta's book on traditional medicine in the Philippines was exceptionally helpful. So as a sort of broader methodology to inform the paper as well, I turned to practice theory, particularly Sherry Ordner, Pierre Bourdieu, and more recent, Dr. Stephen Acabado, whose work in Kiangan Ifugao was also really inspirational. And finally, looking at globalization literature, because this process that I'm trying to describe of New World foods coming into the Philippines and then eventually spreading to the rest of Asia and eventually all over the world is not just a movement of the products themselves, but a movement of ideas about who the products should be used by and in what way. And it's also a movement of people, as will be discussed. So my three main questions out of all of this theoretical literature and ethnographic research were, first, what cultural considerations need to be made for a study of Filipino foods? And I use my scare quotes and my parentheses there intentionally, and I'll explain why in the next slide. The second question was, what is the historical context of changes in Filipino foodways since 1565? So looking at things like the encomienda, the repartimiento, and other social systems introduced by the Americans as well that would have caused or attended these changes. And the third question is more of a practical one and goes back to the practice theory orientation of this paper, which is why to focus on subsistence crops rather than prestige trade goods. And this is where I would take inspiration from Sidney Mintz who was writing about sugar and divert away from something that was eventually incorporated into all levels of British society, but was ultimately a cash crop. So my first question about the considerations needed to study what Filipino food is I looked at it in two ways conceptually, drawing particularly from a Padarai, talking about national cuisines. We have Filipino food as the term to apply for a whole range of what I would call canonical recipes, adobo, sinigang, etc. But within that, you have as many regional cuisines and family recipes and individual preferences as you have regions and families and individuals. And he argues convincingly that the national cuisine may look monolithic on the surface, but it ultimately emerges from not a homogenization, not a cultural hegemonic body that decides what recipes are Filipino or in his case Indian, but rather it's these regional cuisines and personal tastes and other factors like that that give rise to this national cuisine through dialectical interaction. So with that in mind, I shifted my analysis to looking at, okay, what are the building blocks of a Filipino culinary ideology? Well, I believe it should be talked about in a plural sense. And some of the examples that I was coming up with in my reading were, you have multiple religious dietary laws that inform what can be consumed, what can't be consumed, what produces a proper spiritual state, what's conducive to certain ritual practices. And these ritual practices are not only found among indigenous peoples in the Philippines, but among Filipinos of all religions in some form or another. In the general sense of a ritual that is a repeated action that is supposed to accomplish some purpose, is performative in some way. And so related to this, you also have ethnomedical oral traditions that may not be written down, but they are passed down as either specialist knowledge, like for midwives, and also just practical knowledge, like what to eat if you have a certain illness, what to eat to avoid another illness, what to eat to make you healthy. It's the sort of usog-lusog idea. And then there's also the adopted dishes and ingredients, which is what I wanted to focus primarily on in terms of what came from Mexico, what came from South America and the Caribbean. So all of this idea, I tried to subsume under the concept of a culinary ideology, which, drawing from colonialism literature, particularly John and Jean Komaroff, is the sets of attitudes, associations, practices, and other behaviors that construct the social roles of food within a given cultural group or context. So put simply, a culinary ideology, is what makes food food, what is considered edible and what is not. So the second question I looked at about the historical context of changes since 1565, I really started at 1565 rather than 1521, because while we do have some exchange going on with Magellan's expedition, there's no real follow-up. There's no real return Spanish presence until 1565 that we can talk about as really starting what became the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. A couple of years came out of Cebu, but then it's interesting, is a funny story I read as I was researching that. The galleon left from Cebu to Acapulco. It came back to find that the capital had already moved to Panay and then to Luzon. So they had to do some backtracking to find Manila. But so that's my chronological scope. Okay, so at this time, The Portuguese had already entered the western end of Southeast Asia. We know because Magellan was there at the capture of Malacca by the Portuguese in 1511, and Vasco da Gama had already arrived in India several decades before this. So after the Portuguese, we had the Dutch and the English entering as well, and we see militarization increasingly of the Philippine colony that draws more people away from agricultural work and into the Spanish colonial military as auxiliaries, or in the case of Pampanga, as professional soldiers, a standing army. And this continues even until the eventual decline of the Manila galleon trade route in the 1800s, and eventually it stops in the early 1820s to mid 1820s. And so the third consideration that I would take as the historical context is the colonial policies that were put in place by the Spanish and the Americans, so such as the encomienda, labor grants given to specific Spaniards, given these grants by the Viceroy or the Spanish Crown, the repartimiento, which was a system requiring native labor. Essentially, whatever the Spanish needed to be done, they would outsource that. And also the sanitation programs implemented by the American colonial authorities. And so all of these had profound impacts on settlement patterns and means of production, which influenced not only the foods that were consumed, but also how they were consumed, in what contexts they were grown and encountered by Filipinos. So just to briefly discuss the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, the Philippines, long before the Manila and Cebu galleons left for Mexico, was already a hub for international trade. There were trade routes that connected the Philippines to the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, to Borneo, and to mainland China. And eventually, the Spanish tapped into these. They did not create these networks themselves, but they worked their way into them. And then eventually to broader East and Southeast Asia, the mainland. Nagasaki was a prominent foreign port, Macau eventually. And so for the Spanish leg of this voyage from Manila to Acapulco, usually it was 1 to 2 ships per year that would leave each direction. About 10% were lost somehow at sea, either captured or shipwrecked. And most of the time, the Spanish only sent 1 ship. But 1 or 2 was the average. From 1565 until 1826, so quite a long time to be maintaining such a long and arduous trade route. And in these eastbound voyages, most of the crew members were native Filipinos who were impressed to labor on the galleons through repartimiento or other systems. And many of them, interestingly enough, deserted in Mexico. And so the return voyages were mostly crewed by indigenous Mexicans who were recruited or forced to the same labor arrangements. And many of what historical records might say, Spaniards living in the Philippines as a result of this galleon trade were either Mexican-born Spaniards called criollos, or they were these indigenous Mexicans, and sometimes Filipinos who had been previously deserters and then recaptured were deported to the Philippines, usually after being caught making tuba, which Filipinos introduced to the west coast of Mexico and is still produced there to this day. So for my third question, I really wanted to look at why subsistence crops would be so important to this analysis. And in line with practice theory, the idea was that the cultural penetration of these goods would show in things like recipes and ethnomedical practices that would not be controlled, either attempted or successfully, by Spanish or American colonial authorities. And so you see this in the predominance of New World plants like papaya being used as abortifacients. You know, that's something that I can very well imagine the Spanish would not want going on, but it was one of the uses for papaya products and others as well. So what this does for me conceptually in this paper is shift the analytical focus from what were the Spaniards doing, what did the Spaniards want, or what did the elite Mexicans want, but what were regular people in the Philippines doing with these imported goods? Were they taking them as prestige goods like others that had come into the Philippines? That could have been the initial reception, but I think over time, that prestige turned into assimilation, and that assimilation turned into familiarity. And really what I want to do with this paper is suggest directions for further investigation into how these imported crops were used. Because it's a very broad subject, as I said, there's multiple culinary ideologies within the Philippines. There's multiple regional cuisines, many of which use the same ingredients in some of the same ways. But it would really take a local person, an indigenous person, to look at the ways in which these products are used in their area and compare and contrast to see how the penetration of these foods, of these symbols, really operated on a local level. So for some brief examples, I already mentioned papaya. The ones that surprised me, honestly, were siniguelas, chicos, and atis. I was convinced before I wrote this paper, they have to be Filipino, but they are not. They are from Mexico and the Caribbean. Some are from South America, but predominantly, if you look at the origin names of these crops, they're coming from either the Taino language spoken in the Caribbean, the Arawak language family, which is throughout the Caribbean and South America. And most of them are from Nahuatl, which was the predominant language of the Aztec Triple Alliance in Mexico. It seems some of my little circles are off to the side, but you see what I mean. One of the examples that I was most surprised by was that in the lyrics to Bahay Kubo itself, these 5 products, jicama, peanuts, lima beans, calabaza, squash, and tomatoes, are from the Americas, but in this very uncontroversially Filipino folk song describing a very obviously Filipino setting of a traditional bamboo house with a garden of mixed vegetables surrounding it. And so looking at the recipes as well, if I say that they're so-called traditional recipes, I don't mean to say that they're not traditional. I mean to say that they are traditional. They are in every way Filipino. Yet they include these native Mexican and American products in ways that I don't know that the Spanish really had a way to control. So for example, tinolang manok, which is one of my favorites. You can either have sayote squash or papaya, green papaya, and chili leaves, all which are from the American tropics. The sinigang sa bayabas, it's the same deal. You can have camote tops, tomato, guava, chili, all of which are American imports. And inasal and achara, they have to be Filipino. They are Filipino. And yet even in the oil that's used at manginasal, for example, you see ashuete as the colorant in this oil to give it that characteristic red-orange glaze. And the chilies and the bell peppers are also from the Americas. And so, as I mentioned previously, this line between food and medicine is socially constructed. And so when we look at particularly Tan's work, which talks about the intersection of all of these different medical systems that informed Filipino culinary and medical ideologies, we see this overlap of all these different systems that can't really be said to conflict at all times. They intersect, sometimes conflict, depending on who you ask. Medical doctors, for example, but in the ethnographic literature that I was looking at for this paper, it was almost a fill-in-the-blank sort of, or not a fill-in-the-blank, whatever the one is where you can choose multiple options. You can choose whatever option works best for you in a given position, with a given income level or location. And this may not be the case everywhere, but it was in the cases that I was reading about for this paper. And so, as I mentioned, some of these ethnomedical uses, like for abortifacients, are things that the Catholic Church in the colonial period and even today would have an interest in controlling or preventing entirely, and yet it was still going on. You can see in these ethnomedical records collected by Planta, for example, that multiple New World plants were known for their abortifacient effects. But then you also have more innocuous everyday uses like poultices for swelling. Guava leaves in particular are used for all sorts of inflammation, ranging from fevers and headaches all the way to post-circumcision. So it's a very wide range of uses that these New World plants are subjected to. And to wrap up, I have an ulterior motive in this presentation, and it was to hope that the predictions that I've been reading for the last 10 years or so here in the United States will be correct, which are, as Anthony Bourdain here said, and other American food writers have said, that Filipino food is the next big thing. It's going to win over the hearts and minds of the world. It's going to be the next great American cuisine. And in many ways, it kind of already is, but still retains its essential Filipino character, using these new ingredients in ways that conformed to the needs, the wants, the tastes, the worldviews of local Filipinos since the 1500s and to the present. And so this was what my multidisciplinary methods hoped to accomplish, which was to look at all the different ways locally, maybe not all, but a good variety, that could explain how these New World crops entered into Filipino diets, into Filipino medical systems, and ultimately into diets in Asia and all over the world, up to the present, when Jollibee, that looks American, at least that's how I had to explain it to somebody in line who asked me, what is Jollibee? What is Filipino food? You know, it is Filipino food, even if it looks American. And I hope to see that further growth, not just of Jollibee, but also Filipino food. Not entirely jealously, but there's a little bit of jealousy. I want to eat it here more often and more accessibly. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, David. and that was an appetizing presentation. We have around 30 minutes of Q&A, but before I open the floor to questions from the participants of this meeting, before we had David's presentation, Dr. Madrona was cut off abruptly. So I will be turning it over to Dr. Madrona first. I think he has 4 slides left that he wasn't able to present before he got cut off. So maybe Dr. Madrona, around 5 minutes to discuss the contents of those last 4 slides. And after you're done, we can now get questions from the members from the participants of this panel.
So just to summarize with my presentation, sorry for that a while ago. So what I was saying a while ago is concerned much with the various conflicts of citizenship in Spain, from Spanish, again, from the Castilian Naturales to Spanish Naturales, to various groupings in Spain, actually the Catalans, the Basques, and how it would be somewhat also be brought to the colonies. Likewise, with the conflict between and among then the Criollos, the Mestizos, and the natives. So it's somewhat being conflicting then. To the extent then that, as we mentioned, in Philippines actually, the concept of citizenship is something like a new concept, not new, but we're concerned more with residence rather than citizenship. And it would boil down actually with the Código Civil of 1899, of which being applied later on and adopted in the Philippines, even during the American period, the concept again, who are supposedly the citizens of the Philippines. So in the 1930 Constitution later on, there would be a contest between, are we going to adopt the jus soli, or are we going to adopt then the jus sanguinis? And it's quite very interesting that even today, it's always been a concern. I mean, are we going to really focus too much with the jus sanguinis concept or the jus solis, following with our Spanish heritage? So what I'm saying out of the presentation is more with, it's a conflict that even in Spain, supposedly, as that even in Spanish citizenship today, they're trying to actually focus more with getting more of their former colonies or former colonial subjects to be considered as Spanish citizens, just to bring them up. That's why you have a lot of Latin Americans have dual citizens, a Spanish one, as well as that with their own supposedly native citizens. So that's the concept here. It's quite very intriguing. It's very interesting. It's quite likewise very conflicting as to who are the Spanish citizens actually, and how it created something a havoc or a conflict in the colonial empire. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ver, for the added information regarding your presentation. Now, the floor is open for questions from the participants of this panel. So feel free to raise your hand. Well, I can see you if you use the raise your hand function of Zoom. Feel free to type in your questions using our chat box. You can direct your questions to Dr. Madrona, to David, or maybe to both of them. Are there questions from the participants of this panel? Okay. Yes, Dr. Racelis. Dr. Racelis, yes?
Yes, thank you very much. I enjoyed both presentations, but I would like to focus on, I guess, David's on food, which is, unravels a whole new way of looking at that perspective of cross-cultural connections. You're emphasizing, the subsistence crops, which is an interesting concept. And when you get into that in cuisine, have you looked into the gender aspects of that? Because subsistence crops are the areas of what women do, right? They are often the cultivators, the sellers, the cookers, the cuisine constructors. So to what extent, would you say, how would you place that element of who raises the crops, who cooks it, But then when it becomes in effect, traded or disseminated, is that taken over then by a male group? So I just wonder, on that aspect, have you looked into, that kind of division of labor tradition in Filipino society? David.
Okay, am I unmuted now? Yes. Okay, so that is a very excellent point, I think. And what I would say about the gender division is that due to Spanish regulations about women aboard ships, we can say that the physical sailing and the laboring that went into the galleon trade was predominantly male. In fact, there are no records that I could see of women actually sailing on the galleons. But then you're correct. When these crops arrive in the Philippines, there is a gender division of labor between staples like rice and subsistence crops or non-staples. So that would be an excellent further direction that I would like to either take this in myself or see done with the same theoretical framework that I proposed.
Can I follow up with just one additional point?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. One of the things I notice always when Filipino cookery becomes commercialized, there's this emphasis on lutong bahay. In other words, the emphasis is that this is not really a commercial restaurant, even though it may be one, but the emphasis that it's the cooking style of a woman of the household, which means it's genuine, it's indigenous, it's really Filipino. Do you look at that aspect? The lutong bahay.
I did not look at it in this paper, but I can see how that would be important. I believe there's even a restaurant near me in Arizona that's called Lutong Bahay. So I'm familiar with the concept, and it has some very similar emotional responses for me as well, of thinking, yeah, I'm going to get mom's home cooking.
Yeah, exactly.
So yes, I look forward to whatever can be done with the theoretical literature that I put forward to explore that even more than I had space to cover.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Dr. Raceles and David. Other questions from the participants of this panel? We do have some, oh yeah, Richard, yeah. Yes, Richard, go ahead.
Okay, hi. Thank you also to the panelists. This question is directed to Ver. So you mentioned in one of your PowerPoint slides the change in citizenship in 1889 with the Código Civil. Could you elaborate on the changes that happened that year? Is it something that changed the concept of citizenship, or is it just the implementation of a Código Civil?
Thank you for the question, Richard. Hope you can hear me. Actually, with having it to legalize then, or the Spaniards then wanted to legalize the concept of who are the citizens then, because before there's been the concept of residents to citizens. The idea then, I mean, before the 1889 Código Civil and before the 1812 CADIZ Constitution, actually, the concept is that more residents, we're not that concerned much about who are the citizens, except again for those Spaniards. So we're fighting who are the naturales or who should be given such privilege over those of the other. In our concept in the colonial Philippines, the concept would be residents at the moment. So when 1889 Código Civil was being launched here, the idea was that you have the institutionalization of jus sanguinis, the concept here, and likewise jus soli. So both concepts were being instituted in the Código Civil actually, which were changed by the third institution. Again, you're focusing mainly with jus sanguinis, longer police. So for a time, even during the American period, you have the adoption actually of jus soli as one of the modes of acquiring citizenship in the Philippines. So the Código Civil then somewhat changed that outlook, becoming more legalistic and giving rails already then to the people, to the natives, and trying to integrate them more with the greater Spanish Empire or the greater concept of Spanish nationality. Again, different with Spaniards. You're becoming a citizen of Spain, but you're not actually a Spaniard because you lack the blood lineages as pursuant with jus sanguinis. I hope I answer your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ver. Thanks, Richard. Other questions? We still have around 15 minutes to go. We can have a few more questions before we end the panel. By the way, we do have some comments posted on our YouTube live stream. Stephen Acabado is saying that Manila Men in the New World, Filipino Migration to Mexico and the Americas in the 16th century by Flora Racine. It brought stranded Filipino tripulantes and of course Lambanon. And then there's also a comment here about women in the Galleon as wives, so some prominent Spaniards who went to the Philippines by Jose Dennis. There's also a question here, maybe David, you may want to address this question from Jose Dennis posting on our YouTube live feed. Was Spanish adobo influenced by Filipino adobo? Can you answer? Is it okay if you answer that question? Was Spanish adobo influenced by Filipino adobo? A question posted on our Facebook live feed. David, are you still there? Yeah.
Yes, I just had to unmute. So from what I was able to find in terms of the etymology of the word adobo, this is a Spanish derivation of the root adobar, which is to process or to marinate meat. And this was recorded prior to Spanish arrival in the Philippines. So the recipe or the process of adobar, marinating meat, was already Spanish. And so I believe, and there's an article I cite by Pialin Castillo in my paper that discusses this process in the Philippines. I believe that the Spanish or Mexican or Mexican-born Spaniards who arrived in the Philippines saw a process that was already going on in the Philippines, using vinegar to pickle particularly fish, and applied their term adobo to it. And we see an interesting process actually going on at the same time, where the preservation of meat of fish, particularly with vegetables in vinegar that would make up kilawin, actually comes to Mexico and Peru in the form of ceviche. So the short answer is adobo was pre-existent to Spanish colonization, but the word itself was brought by Spaniards. Whether they took that process, I can't be sure, but at least in indigenous Mexican and Peruvian cuisine, the idea was carried over without soy sauce and ginger and garlic, but the same process. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that answers the question. Thank you very much, David.
You're welcome.
Others from other members of other participants of this panel? Feel free to use our chat box. We have a question from Dr. Testa de Ocampo of UP. Testa de Ocampo is asking, what about Spanish mestizos? I think this question is for Dr. Madrona. So it's on the issue of citizenship. What about Spanish mestizos? There, I think you can see Dr. Testa de Ocampo's question via our chat box.
Okay, thank you for that. Actually, as I mentioned again, it's one of the tensions and disputes within the colonial Philippines. The discussion again about how do you categorize the mestizos. As I before, I think I cut off with my internet signal a while. I was just saying about the case of Father Jose Burgos, for instance. While he was the leader of the Philippinization movement or the secularization movement, how would you categorize him? Some would say he's 3/4 Spanish, then 1/4 native. So would it make him actually would make him a Criollo, or would make him a Spanish national, or on the, because again he has blood lineages from that of a Spaniard. So the thing is that in Spain actually, as they were fighting between the Castilian and other nationalities, they're not in the colonial side. On the other hand, they're also having to. It's a problem on how do you distinguish these kinds actually of quote unquote citizenship or quote unquote blood lineages, all of these things. So it's quite difficult. I'm really interested on looking at it on how would you categorize, or is there a need to categorize this like a racial thing, or are you going to focus that all of them are colonized people and they are supposedly united for an onslaught attack against their colonizer?
Thanks, Bear. And there's a follow-up question by Dr. Grace Concepcion. What about mestizos de Sangley? How were they categorized?
Well, as I mentioned again, in the Spanish Philippines, actually it's more with, before the 1889 all are considered as residents. And it's more with the tension and disputes within how you're going to govern them. Because again, actually I appreciate the question that is there, it's quite difficult for us to imagine today that this kind of conflicts, because again, they were not considered as citizens, as we know them, as legal and a political concept today, but rather they're more concerned with ethnic identities that the Spanish colonizers recognize at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Madrona. We still have time to address some of the questions being posted on our Facebook feed. For one, Mercedes Lopez is asking, David, I think this is for you. What do you mean by culinary ideologies?
Okay, so the question was, what do I mean by culinary ideology?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So the definition that I gave in the paper was a culinary ideology is constituted by the set of attitudes, associations, practices, and other behaviors that construct the social roles of food within a given cultural group or context. So what this means in terms of examples would be, for example, the culinary ideology or a culinary ideology of Islam would be keeping to the halal code of what foods, similar to Judaism, similar to Seventh-day Adventists who also keep to the dietary codes given in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But it doesn't always have to be religious like that. It could be, you know, what to eat if you're a mother who has just given birth. You know, in the example given by Esther Cabotaje and other ethnographic materials, you can see certain foods are good for mothers because they are neutral or they don't have bad effects, but then others can cause what she translates as relapse, or the makabughat in, I believe it's Cebuano. So there would be that example. And even I think culinary ideology would extend not just to ritual practice like that, but even diets, like a diet described in the internet or in a magazine is a form of culinary ideology, because it describes the foods that should be eaten for accomplishing a certain purpose, for changing your body in a certain way. And so while that may not have been as relevant to the paper that I was looking at, like the materials I was looking at for the paper, the one that did stand out the most, I was introduced by the Spanish, and that would be humoristic medicine. The idea being that you have 4 humors or types of fluids in your body. There was blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And there's also hot and cold foods. And you have to balance the foods that you eat with your temperament so that you can avoid an overdose, I suppose, of any one of the 4 humors. And so this idea became important for the Spanish in the Philippines as well as in the New World. This is described really well in Rebecca Early's book, The Body of the Conquistador, where she describes how the first Spaniards to arrive in the New World, even up to the 16 and 1700s, were concerned that if they did not eat the foods used to in Spain, so olive oil, red wine, beef, and wheat bread, that they would turn into Indios. Their bodies would change, their temperaments would change into those of Indios. And so the maintaining of the Spanish body was all built in this culinary ideology of eating the right food. So they had to import all of these foods into Mexico to support their colonization efforts. Some American doctors believed this too, as described in Warwick Anderson's book. So it does not just go away with the end of the early modern or medieval period. It still has effects, I would say, up to the present as well. So I'm sorry, that was a kind of long answer, but was it sufficient?
Yeah, no problem, David. No problem. By the way, I just like to read a comment by Dr. Sialsita. Father Burgos's house in Vigan is not in the Barrio de Mestizos, Sangley and Wealthy, but in the Barrio de Naturales. Dr. Francis Navarro, Dr. Chas Navarro asked what were the basic qualifications of citizenship based on Código Civil. There, I think, already answered the question via chat box, but maybe there, do you want to elaborate on that point?
I think based on the Código Civil, actually, it adopts 3 basic classification. You have now jus soli, jus sanguinis, as well as naturalization. So it's quite very expansive. Actually, at the time when the Código Civil was implemented in Spain, as well as later on to the colony, it points out for an expansive categorization of who are the Spanish citizens, or who are considered to be granted such kind of privilege at the same time. So as I mentioned here, you have jus soli. So if you are born in a Spanish territory, jus sanguinis, if you're either of the parents, mother or father, basically are citizens of Spain. Then third, who are naturalized under, of course, the either proceedings in court or proceedings administratively in the Spanish system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ver. Thank you for further explaining your answer to Dr. Chas Navarro's question. We do have room for, I think, 2 more questions. Yeah. Before we end our panel at around 10:15. Questions from the members of this panel? Because if there are none, then we end the panel, the first panel here. Thank you very much to our panelists, David and Ver. We enjoyed your presentations. It's a great way to kick off our conference today. And so our first session has ended. Take note that the next session begins at 10:30. Okay. Thank you very much for participating in this panel. See you in the next session. It begins 10:30. Thank you very much.